Hello, greetings. Happy Sunday. Happy Sunday. Hope you're reaching your highest level of mental, physical, and spiritual well-being, and that you're well this Sunday, and that you're looking forward to the opportunity to interact with us this Sunday as we are looking forward to you being here to talk about the real Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. In this week's episode of Our Ancestors' Voices, a weekly program sponsored by the All African People's Revolutionary Party. I am here. Just like many organizers, a lot of your life is on the road. So I'm on the road and I don't even know where I am right now in a hotel room that it looks like something out of the Addams family. And Jethro Bodine checked me into the room um, I think I'm almost certain there's a Klan rally happening down the street. But that's okay because my reasons for being here are firmly rooted in the struggle to build capacity so that we can bring liberation one day. So that's a good thing. And that's the reason why we do it, because I understand a lot of people wouldn't want to be in this circumstance. And that's why you're not involved in any organized struggle for justice. But everything's dialectical. And the positive side of that is this type of work is what's going to put us in a better position to be able to move forward on a collective level and even on an individual level, you all. I do this type of thing all the time. And I think that's the primary reason why I don't have the kind of issues that I hear people talk about they have all the time. They don't feel adequate. They don't feel like their lives have meaning. I know my life has meaning. Sometimes it has more meaning than I want it to. But my point is that when you engage in life work that's bigger than yourself, that's designed to bring about a result that is bigger than something that's just benefiting you and your individual family, that's how you build your confidence and your self-esteem. That's how you build your ability to feel like you're making a worthwhile contribution to the world that we all live in. So that's the positive side that you will never understand until you actually participate in the work, not just the reading books part. That's important, obviously, but the actual work that the information you're getting from the books should encourage you to want to take part in. So we're glad you're here. Hopefully, the whole point of this program and all our programs in the APRP is to hopefully encourage you to want to get involved in that struggle and in that work. So we give honor to the indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere. We uh, think of them, especially when we travel to these rural areas, as I'll be doing the next several weekends. We think about them a lot and their struggle for justice, and we are inspired by their example, and we want to be able to provide them all of the support that we possibly can. Historically, that's what they did for us, whether you know it or not, whether you understand it or not. That's exactly what they did for us. So we want to do the same thing for them, and we've always done that for them as well. We want to continue that. And our African ancestors, of which we are certainly talking about, a great one today in the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., as we approach the commemoration of his assassination, April 4th, from 1968, we honor all of our ancestors who are the very reason that we're here today. So we're thankful for them. And we just explained quickly who we are and what we do. Our Ancestors' Voices is sponsored by the All African People's Revolutionary Party, AAPRP. AAPRP is a revolutionary, independent, mass, pan-African political party that is based in Africa. We are all over the world, and we are all fighting for the same thing, no matter what foods we eat, wherever we are, what languages we speak, wherever we are, what clothes we wear, wherever we are. We are all fighting for the same thing, what God we worship or don't worship, wherever we are. And that same thing is Pan-Africanism. And we define it correctly as one unified socialist Africa. I always have respect for anyone that does work for justice. A lot of people, the objective we are focused on, laser focused on, is too big for you, too much of a vision for you. You want to, a lot of people want to do something on a local level. There's no contradiction with that. Do that work. It needs to be done. But for me, I've always been a big picture type person. And for me, the problem is bigger than what's happening locally. It's bigger than what's happening nationally or statewide. It's a worldwide problem. That's where our problem started, and that's the only way in my mind that it'll ever be resolved. So one unified socialist Africa, that's as soon as I heard it 40 plus years ago, I knew it was the answer for me, and I knew that that was what I was going to dedicate my life to bring it into existence. And I'm very proud to say that for the last 40 years, 40 plus years, it's actually more than that, but 40 years in the APRP, I've done everything I possibly can to do that work and will continue to do it as long as I'm physically, mentally, and spiritually able to. And our work to achieve Pan-Africanism is outlined in Kwame Nkrumah's Handbook of Revolutionary Warfare. It's a great book that you should read, not just as an individual, but as a part of a collective organizing effort, because that's the purpose of the book, is to provide direction for how we achieve Pan-Africanism by uniting the revolutionary Pan-African forces on the ground that agree with the definition of one unified socialist Africa for Pan-Africanism, as Pan-Africanism rather. And our work is specifically that. And you have to participate. It took me a good 2 or 3 years in the APRP work study process to understand that work, because especially if you're in one of these Western capitalist countries, nothing prepares you to understand the concept of African people all over the world working together for one objective. Everything you've learned has told you that that not only is not happening, but is actually impossible. Everything you've learned has told you that. So it's almost, it's an oxymoron to tell you, yeah, this is happening, unless you experience yourself. That's the only way you can understand it and see it. That's the only way you can understand it and see it. So that's why we encourage people to join work study circles, but also to engage in the work. Because for me, I've done the party work on the ground all over the world, all over Africa, Europe, the Caribbean. So I've seen the work. I've participated in the work with people in all of those places. So I know it's happening. I know what our potential is. But if you just like you're in the United Snakes and you've never traveled outside of the United Snakes and you're talking about it, I know you want to believe it, but it's going to be very difficult, because everything you've experienced is designed to make you believe that what we're talking about here is just not possible, because we don't control any of the information flow in this backward cesspool. So just think about that. And our Ancestors' Voices, again, is hosted each week by the APRP, and APRP organizers myself and Shakura, my biological and ideological daughter. And speaking of Shakura, to start this topic, the real legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King, I will turn it over to Shakura.
Thank you. Thank you. Greetings, everyone. Hello, hello. We hope you are well. I always enjoy talking about our comrade, Dr. Martin Luther King, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, especially because I feel more and more of his presence, because I am fortunate to be on Cherokee land, colonized to be called Memphis. And as many of you know, this is where he took some of his final breaths. So just 20 minutes from where I'm standing, roughly, give or take traffic, you can witness the balcony where he stood, where he was murdered. And so just thinking about, just how I always just get really caught up when I hear, that people don't want to be connected to their ancestors. And I get caught up when I hear people saying that they don't, want to have a connection. They don't want to acknowledge that they're related, or that there's, that running through their blood or their veins, whatever that looks like. Excuse me. It's always weird to me, because we have such a great opportunity to be impacted and influenced by all of the ancestors. I mean, they became ancestors if they were trying to do something for their people. And unfortunately, they lost their lives because of it. And King is a great example of that. So many others, right, have unfortunately left this earth because it wasn't anything that they could do to be stopped except for them being murdered, right? And so, these people went through houses being bombed. They went through death threats, people calling, telling them that they're going to hurt, in some cases, rape their family members, right? And so I say all this to say this is a norm under capitalism, because at the end of the day, you basically have two ways that you can behave in capitalism. You can be, a really good house slave, and you can submit, as we talked about last weekend, right? Africans who are very confused and who think that, subduing under the capitalist principle, accepting it, promoting it, living by it is the best way that they can live their life and do what they have to do. And because of that, you have people who have seen them as puppeteers to be able to do that, because Africans are, dispendable, right? And so there's that. And then there's also these Africans who are fighting back. And because of it, they need to be taken care of or neutralized, right? And so it's just important to understand that under capitalism, that's the norm for you to either be one or the other. And if you are, in fact, the second, then you have to go, because the whole purpose of capitalism is to remind you what your responsibility is to help that system make as much money as possible. That's the whole purpose of capitalism. It never ever has to be mindful of how your mental health is doing. Capitalism doesn't have to think about how it might be exacerbating your mental health. Capitalism doesn't have to think about how your baby is sick with a fever again, and your insurance hasn't kicked in yet. So you're not really sure how you're going to get them the medicine they need. Capitalism doesn't have to think about how stressed you must be because you just lost your job and you just bought a house and you're trying to figure out how to get the bills paid in between. Capitalism doesn't have to worry about if your parents are sick and you now are a caregiver, or maybe you're a sandwich generation and you're taking care of your children and your parents. This system does not have to give a darn about any of those things, because the bottom line is everything is centered around this system making as much profit as possible so that private entities, corporations, organizations can continue to make as much money as possible. That is the objective, you all. This system does not care at all about any of us, period. But, comma, additionally, it does not care about us if we are trying to do work to encourage more resistive propaganda, if you will, where we're trying to encourage people to consider what it means to speak out against capitalism, to resist, to fight back, to be aware, to be knowledgeable of just how vicious this system is, right? Certainly not going to care about us, but we can't do this kind of work and not have repercussions. I just talked about that, right? And so, just so we're clear, this is the same system that is not interested in representing people because it's all about gaining profit. And in case this is not clear, a quick example for you, we have our circumstances where we may be living in an environment and maybe we decide that we want to relocate. And so when we relocate, maybe we're now in an environment where the appliances are newer, right? And usually what happens is under capitalism, you may have been paying a certain amount of rent in one area, but if you're moving to another area where the appliances are better, or maybe the crime is lower, then your renter's insurance might be cheaper because the crime is lower, but that still means that you will have to pay more money because you have new appliances. Now, if you take the fact that you live in an area where crime is higher, well, your renter insurance is going to be more expensive. And you probably don't have renter's insurance because you want to. You have it because you need to in order to live at the apartment complex. So the apartment doesn't want to just make money off of you because you pay rent every month. They also want to make money off of you by charging you for water. They want to make money off of you by charging you for the renter's insurance. And if you have an animal, you'll probably have to pay for that. And then they'll find some other ways to jack on as many prices as they can, right? And so then if we add in the fact that you're living in this place where you have newer appliances, you'll probably have to pay for those too, just because they're newer, right? And so just thinking about these different ways that, as my grandmother used to say, everyone has their hand out. And as a child, I didn't understand what she meant. but may she rest in peace. I understand it very clear now as an adult, and I cannot believe how intelligent she was. And I just wish that I had known that sooner. I mean, how intelligent was that? Everybody has their hand out, and she's absolutely right. She's absolutely right. So we just have to remember, you all, this system is not designed to benefit us. And in case you're like still trying to connect the dots, when we think about capitalism, you have to understand this system impacts every single part of what makes you a living being individual. It impacts every single part. Capitalism definitely impacts us from a health standpoint. I've talked about that in many different ways. We think about how certain groups of people, specifically those who are impoverished, those who are unhoused. We have our comrades, our LGBTQ folks that have severe health disparities. Our indigenous comrades have severe health disparities. Our African comrades have severe health disparities. Our Asian descent comrades, people who are colonized, people who are poor, people who are non-male, people who are non-hetero. All of these different folks have some serious issues. People who are differently abled have some of the highest cervical cancer rates I've ever seen in my life. And it is ridiculous to me that that is such an astronomical number. And yet it seems that no one is doing anything about it. Well, no one is doing anything about it because that's insignificant. No one cares, right? And so these are the things that we think about. And so capitalism impacts what kind of education people are to receive. And I'm talking about primary, but I'm also talking about secondary. I'm talking about the fact that when you go to college, you're not even supposed to literally think for yourself, even as a college student. And how ironic is that? Because the whole purpose of you going to college is to literally find your voice, right? That's why you're supposed to be writing these papers, right? That's why you're supposed to take on these positions in these papers, right? What's your argument? What's your thesis statement? But yet, if you say the wrong thing in the wrong class with the wrong professor, well, now you might be risking getting in trouble or maybe getting a lower grade because your professor may not like something you said. I had a student who turned a paper in last week, and they talked about how there was a Occupy Palestine protest on campus. And in their words, it was nonviolent and it was peaceful. That's what the students said. And the students said in the assignment, they said, I really feel some type of way saying this to an SJSU instructor. And I was thinking to myself, well, I don't think you know very much about my politics, even though I talk about Occupy Palestine all the time in my class. I talk about how much I support it. I talk about the contradictions. I talk about why we need to understand what Zionism is. I mean, I've talked about it in great lengths, but apparently they missed that part of the information. They missed that part of the conversation. So, with that being said, my point is this student can't even express themselves in their own assignment because they have so much fear that there will be repercussions, that they will be retaliated against, when in actuality, it's their assignment. They should be able to write whatever they want. And I should be confident in my own beliefs where I shouldn't be intimidated or offended by what they have to say. But that's not the world that we live in, right? We see that happening in different cases where we have an impact on education from a primary standpoint as well as a secondary standpoint. Even how we treat one another is impacted by capitalism. And if you don't believe me, just think about how many times a day you drive past somebody who is unhoused and you don't even notice that they're standing there. Just think about how many times a day you are thinking about yourself and your entirety, because that's what this world promotes: individualism, selfishness, where you don't even have to think about how other people are being impacted by things or how other people are still trying to include you because they are not individualistic and selfish. We've talked about that in great detail before. It always amazes me when I hold the door for people just how many people don't say thank you. It really amazes me, like to this day. And I've started to just be aggressive back and say, you're welcome, because it's like, are you that in your own space that you don't even have to acknowledge? I could have just let it fall in your face. Like, do you just not acknowledge that? But there's so many people that either have expectations, they're not thinking about you because they're already thinking about the next thing they need to do. And I think that's precisely the problem. How we treat each other, humane treatment, is directly impacted by capitalism. You're absolutely right if you think that. It is absolutely impacted. The entitlement that people have, the expectations when you go to restaurants and you have to wait longer for your food, how angry people get, all of that is a result of capitalism. How you treat service workers, a direct result of capitalism, a direct result of capitalism. Whether or not you decide to tip in a livable wage approach, direct result of capitalism. I don't have a lot of money. I'm a graduate student and I work part time, but I still try to acknowledge service workers. I try to acknowledge them from a humane standpoint where I literally will say to them, I appreciate you. Thank you so much for doing this. You are appreciated. I hope you are well. And then I try to acknowledge them financially because they don't have to do their work that they're doing. And if they decided to call out of work, no one would deliver my tacos to me. No one would be able to help me buy the lotion at Walgreens. No one would be able to help me get the toothpaste if all of them decided not to come to work to stock the shelves so that we could get the toothpaste. But we gotta understand that being in an organization that's working for justice kind of helps your brain to be programmed in that way, you all. Because if you're not organizing, you're not going to understand that it's not about you. You're not going to understand that. You're not. And it amazes me whenever I bring that up and people are baffled because they don't understand that. Service workers, when I say to them, thank you so much for being here, one person went off on me and said, this is my job. I got to be here. And I said, actually, you don't. You could have called out today. And because you're here, I'm able to get the receipt that I need. So thank you. And they just had a dumbfounded look on their face. And I thought to myself, what did I do wrong? All I did was show appreciation, and they couldn't even accept it because that's the world we live in where it is so abnormal. It's so abstract. It's so uncommon. It's a unicorn that is tap dancing, and people don't know how to react to it. And that's so sad to me. That is so sad to me. But if you are a true organizer, you understand that you have to keep going. You understand that capitalism has had years, it's had centuries, it's had a lot of practice to remind people every day that they're insignificant, that they don't matter. And more importantly, it's had a lot of practice and time to let people know that they're not of value because they don't have a lot of money. And so a lot of the people that we end up trying to help and work with, that's because they're working in these low pay waging positions. And so I think it's our responsibility as humanitarians and as humanity to understand that we can change this system. But we first have to join an organization that's working for justice so that we can start to enhance our ideological toolkit. And then we can start to understand just how messed up capitalism has made things. And then from there, I think we can have a conversation where we're acknowledging that because money is more important than people, that means the system is not going to be honest. It's never been honest about anything that it has. Every single thing that capitalism has is stole from somebody else, including actual people from Africa and actual land from the indigenous people. It stole everything. Okay. So once we understand that, then we can understand the system can't be trusted. And that's when we can start to help other people understand you have an option. You don't have to just understand and accept this. You don't have to just accept this. You can resist this. You can push back against it. You don't have to be happy about this. You don't have to be grateful. You know what I mean? People say to me, I'm just grateful to have a job. And I understand that. But just because you're grateful to have a job doesn't mean your job can treat you like trash and not pay you livable wages. That's unacceptable. But you and your coworkers would have to organize together to resist that. It would have to be a collective voice saying, we're not going to take this sitting down. And then that's when change can really occur. And so as I prepare to move to the next slide, I'll just remind folks even how we navigate our economic system is impacted by capitalism. Our ratio of unemployment rates is impacted by capitalism. How the city or the country is developed is impacted by capitalism. I don't know where you all are joining in from today, but I think in great detail about how city structures, specifically city planning, I think about how much of a poor job they have done, specifically with the homophobic chain of Chick-fil-A. And I think about how it's really unsafe to build Chick-fil-A's, A, because they're homophobic, and B, because they're, stuck on their Christian religion. And I just can't go down that road today. But from a city planning standpoint, those are some of the worst constructed buildings in the city, if you think about it. because it seems like they're always built on the most busiest streets in the city. And I don't know about you all, but here in Memphis, there's literally 3 lanes, and the far right lane is completely blocked off because there's 18 cars in line trying to turn in this stupid parking lot for some chicken that probably has cocaine in it. I mean, I don't know why people are so addicted to that chicken. I don't know. So just thinking about that in greater detail, that's a direct impact of capitalism. That's a direct impact where you might easily risk having an automobile accident if you don't know and you're visiting that city and you don't understand what the traffic is. You think it's traffic because it's traffic on the street. You have no idea that you're in the wrong lane and you literally need to get over. Otherwise, people are going to think you're in line going to a restaurant that you have no business going to. It's really that, but I've seen that though. I've seen that in several cities that I've gone to visit, and I'm asking myself, why isn't there a better plan in place for this? I don't get it. And so, as I prepare to talk about this next slide, we just have to think in more detail about how, in fact, this has been our norm. This has been the consistentness that we have thought about. This has been what it's always been. It's always been about profiting. It's always been about making as much money as possible. This is why when you go to pump gas, if you choose to use a specific type of payment, maybe you use a credit card or maybe you use cash, then you might have to pay the cash fee if you use your debit card. And I'm always baffled by that because gas itself is $65. So you want me to give you $65 and $3.95 on top of that? Wow. Capitalism. As much money that it can get out of you, it will continue, 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 continue. That's why we have to rise up. That's why we have to push back. That's why we have to organize to push back. We can't push back individually. And we should organize together because there's more of us than the people running the system. And they will learn that we have had enough, but we're going to have to come together in order to do that. And we don't have to be in the same organizations to come together, not by any means. We'll talk in great detail about some of the different organizations that Dr. King was in, but he had many different organizations with many different groups of people. Some that would help each other organize, but had their own intended organizations that they respectively belonged to. And that was that. And so, just thinking in great detail about this, we understand that we have a responsibility, if you will. Just because this has been our past, it doesn't mean it has to be our future. And more importantly, it doesn't mean that we have to promote this as the future. We can make a decision to change things. We see that more and more indigenous colonized people, African people, are still being gunned down. We see that indigenous colonized African people are still dying during their pregnancy or their labor or their delivery. We see that indigenous colonized African people who might even be LGBTQ are committing higher suicide rates and having more issues when it comes to accessing care that is gender affirming. I mean, we see all of these different things across the world. And so we have to ask ourselves, when is enough going to be enough? And why do we think we need to tolerate something if we know it's simply not working for us? Why don't we believe that we can change the circumstances? What do we need to do to increase our self efficacy? We can take a great page out of Dr. King, but there's so many others who have already paved the way for us. So the question just becomes, what is it in fact that we're waiting for? Why is it March of 2024 and you still have not joined an organization that's working for justice? What's stopping you? And what would allow you to take the first step into doing that? If you don't have any organizations that you like, what's stopping you from starting one? What's the worst that can happen if you take that step out on faith? Shay.
Ashe, Ashe, thank you. Obrigada, Asante Sana. Thank you very much. And we will just take what you gave us, Shakura, and just continue on and direct it to Dr. King and his specific legacy. And I wanted to start by framing it in the context of who exactly was Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, because the capitalist system, as you said eloquently, it does such a great job of creating the image of Dr. King and anybody that struggles for justice that they want us to have. And they're able to do that successfully because they know the overwhelming majority of us will not take 5 minutes to investigate the answer on our own, and that we will rely on our enemies to give us all the information we have about what Dr. King did and who he was. So they shaped the narrative for us. And the narrative that they've created is of this guy that was nonviolent. They certainly want you to know that up front. He was nonviolent. He loved everybody. They want you to know those things about him, and that he fought for integration. They want you to know that. That's how they want to define Dr. King. And for most of us, that's how we define him, because we only, again, know what our enemies have told us about him. But that's not really at all who Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was. So we want to talk about specifically who he was. And we start with the pictures on the screen. If you're looking at the screen, we have a picture of Dr. King at Ghana's independence ceremony on March 6, 1957, with Kwame Nkrumah there at the top. Kwame Nkrumah invited Dr. King there as a guest, and Dr. King and Coretta Scott King went there, and they developed a relationship in 1957 that they maintained until Dr. King was assassinated in 1966. In fact, Nkrumah was somewhat of a mentor, quiet as it's kept, to Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. And then in the middle, we had the one meeting between Dr. King and Malcolm X in June of 1964 at the U.S. Capitol, when King was there lobbying on behalf of the Civil Rights Act, which was being debated by Congress at that time. And then on the bottom, in 1967, we have a picture of Dr. King at the headquarters of the Nation of Islam in Chicago, here in the United States of America. And King is meeting with the longtime leader of the Nation of Islam, Elijah Muhammad, there. And the point of these pictures, you all, is that none of these three individuals that King is meeting with here endeared him to the capitalist system. All three of these people, regardless of how you see them or what you know or don't know about them, whether we're talking about Kwame Nkrumah or Malcolm X or Elijah Muhammad, neither one of them were people that the U.S. capitalist system looked at and considered positive role models for the African masses. And I would argue, especially as it relates to Malcolm X, and even more so Kwame Nkrumah, they were considered public enemies number one by the capitalist system. And so for Dr. King to decide that he even wanted to be seen, and not only that, but to meet with these folks, speaks to the first point that I have here, that Dr. King was a man of principle. And what that means is that he was committed to doing his absolute best to do what's right. And if you still don't really understand what that means, think of it like this. Are you a person who, when you perform an action that involves other people, you have a deep-seated concern about whether that action was the correct action, whether it was a fair action, whether it was an action that was designed to uplift people? And if you have any doubt, even if the part where people were not uplifted had nothing to do with your action or intentions of your actions or what happened on your part, you still find yourself spending a lot of time rehashing what happened to try to make sure you can understand that everything you did was designed to do the right thing. Are you that type of person? Because if you are, that's the definition of being a person of principle. There are a lot of you out there who you don't give a damn what you do and who's hurt by what you do. You're not people of principle. You're people who are only interested in yourself. And I'm sure you know people, if you're not one of them, who operates like that. They don't care what they say and how it hurts people. They don't care what they do and how it hurts people. All they care about is, at the end of the day, whatever's happening, what the end result does to benefit them. We're not talking to those kind of people. That's the scum of the planet. We're talking about a man who had principles. And what that means is that even though you have a belief, like someone said to me once, if you really believe something, you would never question it. And I thought, I didn't know how to respond to them when they said that to me. But now I think that's one of the most backward things you could say to someone. Because I know that when you have a belief and you're a person of principle, you are constantly questioning it, constantly questioning it. That's why I know that no one will ever be able to talk me down. You have to work really hard, and you're still not going to be successful in terms of talking me down about my commitment to revolutionary Pan-Africanism and scientific socialism. And the reason why I know that that's not going to happen is because I've spent my whole life battling internally over those concepts. I don't need you to say anything to me. I battle internally. Am I doing the right thing? Is this the best way to get to it? And from doing that constantly, it's like sharpening steel. After a while, it becomes pretty much refined and you understand exactly what it'll do. And this is who Dr. Martin Luther King was. He was a man of principle. He wasn't concerned about the capitalist system deciding to move against him because he saw the importance of having dialogue with the people you see he had it with on the screen. He wasn't concerned about that. He wasn't even concerned about whether the positions he took were positions that would go against the power structure of the US capitalist system and the world system. He wasn't concerned about that when he came out against the Vietnam War in 1967. He made that decision based on doing what's right. And if you talk to the organizers, those that are still among us, from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee that were engaged in those daily struggles with Dr. King, because, you know, we didn't have enough people that we glorify the 60s. But the truth is, we didn't have enough people who were involved in the freedom struggle in the 60s. And the fact that we didn't have enough people was borne out in the main civil rights organizations at that time in the 1960s, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Congress of Racial Equality, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which was King's organization, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. Those four groups were the four main groups that were carrying out the civil rights fight. The boycotts, the sit-ins, the freedom rides, the voter registration work in the South, all of those things, those four organizations were in the forefront of that work. And none of those organizations were large and strong enough to carry that work on their own. So they had to form what was called the Committee of Federated Organizations, COFO. So this is the reason why you had SNCC Corps and SCLC constantly working together in the NAACP. This is the reason why Andrew Goodman, the European Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner were core members, and James Chaney was a SNCC member, the three civil rights workers that were murdered in Mississippi in 1964. That's why they were from different organizations together, because they didn't have enough people to do the work on their own. So this is important to recognize, because the SNCC organizers will tell you that they waged intense struggle with Dr. King. They didn't wage the same struggle with Roy Wilkins from the NAACP or Whitney Young from the Urban League, because they didn't see those people as people of principle. They waged it with Dr. King because they knew if presented with the truth, Dr. King would change his mind. And on the Vietnam War, that's exactly what he did, because that's who Dr. King was. And even on the question of the Black Power movement, Dr. King always refused to criticize it. He did express his views, which were much more moderate than what was expressed by people like Kwame Ture and Jamil Abdullah Alameen, or formerly H. Rap Brown and Stokely Carmichael, and the Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale and the Black Panther Party and all of the more radical elements, the Republic of New Africa. That wasn't who Dr. King was, but he refused to let the system use him against those organizations, which is what the system constantly attempted to do, because he was a man of principle. And bigger than that, he continued to work with those organizations. And he wore buttons that were their pictures. You can find a Dr. King wearing Black is Beautiful buttons. So he understood, and he talked about how the urban rebellions were the fact that this was such a racist country. He didn't blame the African masses. He was no Candace Owens or no Larry Elder or no Coon Williams or none of these clowns and buffoons that are out here today. He was a person of principle. And so that's what you have to understand about Dr. King. And you also can't make the mistake of confusing nonviolence with cowardice. Just because Dr. King had a principle of nonviolence doesn't mean he was a coward. The mistake Dr. King made is thinking that nonviolence was a principle. Nonviolence is a tactic. And the people in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee understood that, because unlike King, they stayed in Mississippi and Alabama for months at a time. They didn't just come and give a speech and leave the next day, which is what Dr. King did. With the action in Selma, that's what he did. He didn't stay in Selma for months. He was there for a couple of days and he left, because that's what he did. He was a mobilizer in that sense. The SNCC people were organizers. So they stayed at people's houses. They stayed with people. like Medgar Evers in Mississippi, like Amzie Moore. You should know who these people are. You know, they were key to the civil rights movement. And they would sit there in Amzie Moore's mouth. That man was a giant in our struggle for justice, a Mississippi sharecropper in the early 60s, and was respected by those cracker Europeans in Mississippi because they knew if they came to Mr. Moore's house and messed with him, they would leave with some buckshot up their ass. They knew that. So they didn't mess with Amzie Moore. And the SNCC people would come and stay with Mr. Moore, and they'd be talking about nonviolence, and Mr. Moore would be cleaning his shotguns, and he'd be telling them, oh, okay, well, you go on here on with that nonviolence and see how far it gets you with these people down here in Mississippi. So the SNCC people learned that they could not tell people like Mr. Moore that he had to be nonviolent. This man lived with violence every day of his life. And so they understood that, and they brought that principled struggle to people like Dr. King. And this is why Dr. King wavered, even though he himself, on an individual level, was committed to the concept of nonviolence as a principle. He began in the latter stages of his life to waver on saying that this is something that the overwhelming majority of our people had to endorse, which was a position he held early in his civil rights career. In fact, he never once denied the participation of the Deacons for Defense, an armed African organization of ex-World War II and Korean War veterans, to participate in protecting the marchers, because Dr. King wasn't stupid like a lot of us are today. He understood that if the Deacons had not participated, there were tons of people killed in the civil rights movement. There would have been a whole lot more if it weren't for the Deacons being there, ready to fire, and oftentimes having to fire their weapons at white supremacists in order to stop them from terrorizing us. So don't confuse nonviolence with cowardice. The mistake King made was he didn't live long enough to recognize that nonviolence has to be a tactic. You have to use it when it works. When it doesn't work, you have to do something else. Just like a lot of you today are confused about voting. You think voting is a principle. You don't understand that it's a tactic. You use it when it works. When it doesn't work, you do something else. But your enemy has convinced you that it's the principle. So you think if you don't vote, there's nothing else you can do to advance the struggle for justice. That's just what the capitalist system wants you to think, because with that thinking, you'll never do anything. They'll have all the elections in the world, and you'll get absolutely nothing out of it, and you'll never do a damn thing about it because you think that's the only thing you can do because it's a principle in your mind. It's a tactic, just like nonviolence. And Dr. King was not driven by ego. This man was constantly disrespected. Y'all don't understand that because you got this Wells Fargo, AT&T image of Dr. King that's on the commercials every January 15th. But the reality is that this country hated Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. The government officials in this nation, when he was alive, they loathed this man. They hated him. J. Edgar Hoover, the longtime director for the Federal Bureau of Investigations, called Martin Luther King the most notorious liar in the country. That's what he said. And Lyndon Johnson agreed with Hoover when he said it. Lyndon Johnson was president at that time. These people hated Dr. King. Dr. King went to Medgar Evers' funeral in 1963 in Jackson, Mississippi. And Roy Wilkins, and leader of the NAACP, and all these other highfalutin Negroes, they refused to let Dr. King speak at Medgar Evers' funeral, even though Medgar Evers had worked consistently, even though Medgar Evers was an NAACP leader, and he had worked consistently with Dr. King. He was the only person in NAACP in that region of Mississippi at that time who was pushing the NAACP more and more to work within COFO that I just explained to you about. And he had invited Dr. King to come speak in rural Mississippi. And so Dr. King should have spoken at Medgar Evers' funeral. He was the most respected person there. And these people blocked him from speaking because they didn't want to lose their prestige to Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. But Dr. King held his composure at that funeral. He recognized that it was bigger than him. It wasn't about him. It was about the contributions of Medgar Evers, who was gunned down by some reactionary racist, who some of their relatives are probably in this town I'm in right now. And so he didn't let that bother him. He just sat there and principally made it through the ceremony. And he did that often because he wasn't driven by that kind of ego. He was a man of principle. And so let's talk about who Dr. King was not. Now that we said a few things about who he was not an organizer. And this is not meant to throw shade at Dr. King, But it's important, if you really want to understand the legacy in the proper context, it's important to understand this because his inability to organize, to be an organizer, is what made it difficult for him to understand these contradictions he had that I just talked about. Meaning he wasn't an organizer, so he didn't understand the difference between principles, strategy, and tactics. Organizers always understand the difference between principles, strategies, and tactics. Mobilizers are not required to understand the difference between principles, strategies, and tactics. The difference is principles are values that you never compromise. Like for me, principles are Africa is primary. America is not primary to me. I don't give a damn what happens in America. I'm concerned about Africa, the national home of African people. Let me say, I don't mean I don't give a damn. I care about it in the context of how the indigenous people gain their sovereignty here in America. But I'm talking about in terms of this empire that currently exists, I don't give a damn about that at all. If some people came and invaded this country right now, I would go find me a place on a hillside to watch it happen. I wouldn't give a damn about it one bit. And if you would, you're crazy as hell, because I believe that I'm going to stand up and fight for people that are going to stand up and fight for me. And this country has never fought for us, never fought for us. So you're a damn fool if you're going to risk your life for a country. And I'm talking even you in the U.S. military. You risk your life for a country that wouldn't do a damn thing for you. You're crazy. You need counseling to do that. I'm sorry. You need to go see a counselor. And not me. Never in hell would I stand up and fight for somebody that's not going to fight for me. To hell with them. I give them the same level of respect that they give us. But he was not an organizer. He never was an organizer. And so because he wasn't an organizer, he didn't understand that principles are values you never compromise. Strategies are techniques you engage in to achieve an objective. And the tactics are the things that you carry out to make that objective happen. And so he wasn't really clear on all of those things. And this is borne out by why he was not able to recognize some of the contradictions, like his position around the state of Israel, for example. He didn't live long enough to sort that out because he just was not clear on this question of being an organizer and revolution and contrasting that with strategy and tactics and understanding those things from an ideological standpoint. He had faith, but religious faith is not the same as having principled ideological struggle around questions of movement and advancement. It's not the same. And so he just didn't live long enough to sort these things out. So he wasn't a person who had the kind of vision to understand that the majority of people in the world are never going to be nonviolent and are never going to be fighting to integrate into the capitalist system. That's just not ever going to happen. It never has, and it never will. I know you think that it has because they told you that that's the only thing that can possibly happen. But if you look at the world from a more scientific standpoint, it's never happened, and it never will. In fact, capitalism is in a sharp decline. That's why you're seeing the crazy things that you're seeing happening the way they happen. And then King had not advanced in his consciousness yet to understand, like I said, this question of Zionism. He didn't understand that at all. He was very confused about the question of Zionism. He was a member of Black Americans in Support of Israel Committee, BASIC. He was a working member of that. And when SNCC came out in 1967 against the Zionist state of Israel, Dr. King was offended by that. He just didn't understand it. Again, this is his shortcoming and not understanding. I'll give you an example. Like a lot of you today, you'll say that in the 60s, we had alliances with the Jewish community. What is an alliance? If you're an organizer, you understand that an alliance is when you work together. You take all the risks together. You take all the defeats together. You take the costs together, all at the same time. Now, other than a few, there certainly were people who were European Ashkenazi Jews who participated in the civil rights movement, but these are individuals, just a few individuals that did that, a handful of people that did that. The majority of the Ashkenazi Jewish community weren't involved in the civil rights movement. I'm talking about in terms of participating in it. They weren't involved in it. Sure, people wrote checks. They certainly wrote checks, but that's not alliance. Alliance is not you write a check and I risk getting killed. That's not an alliance. That's a puppet master relationship. That's what that is. And that's borne out by the fact that as soon as SNCC decided to take principal positions that didn't align themselves with the U.S. Zionist movement, the U.S. Zionist movement cut off the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. As soon as they were willing to criticize Israel, they cut them off. So King he hadn't developed an understanding of these types of contradictions yet to see that happening. He didn't understand that. There's no question today, I'm sure if King were alive today, he would understand that the Zionist state of Israel is a terrorist state because he was a person of principle. He would have come to that understanding, but he just didn't live long enough to do that. And finally, King was not perfect. There's a lot of weight put to this question of whether he was unfaithful to Coretta Scott King, his wife. And to that, what I'll say is two things. One, whatever happened there, that's between him and Coretta Scott King. And if you study Coretta Scott King, the way she carried herself, the FBI wanted to discredit Dr. King. So the terrorist J. Edgar Hoover, along with Nixon and Johnson and all those other cracker coordinators, they developed a packet that supposedly provided evidence of King's infidelities, and they sent that package to Coretta Scott King. And that woman was a woman of principle. She never revealed the contents of that package. She never said a word against her husband because she understood that had she come out and done that, it would have been used to discredit his legacy. And she recognized and understood, unlike most of us today, that his legacy wasn't his individual legacy. It was the legacy of the masses of African people. So whatever pain she felt, she dealt with that herself. And for that reason, I respect the hell out of Coretta Scott King. And that's what you got to understand, is that he wasn't perfect. That's the first thing. The second thing about him not being perfect is that the tremendous pressure that this man was under, I'm not making excuses for him being unfaithful to his wife, if he was indeed unfaithful. And it certainly looks like he was. But what I am saying is I'm not going to listen to somebody that's scared to walk out their door at night pass judgment on the pressure Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, who lived in constant danger of being killed for his principles and the work he was doing. How the hell are you to criticize that? You probably wouldn't, if somebody just drove and swerved towards you on the road, you would probably go and have to be unfaithful because you couldn't handle the pressure of that one experience. So I'm not in a position to judge him on that. What I know is that I don't know him because of what women he was with. I know him because of his contribution to the African struggle for liberation. So I respect him for that. And anything beyond that, that's between him and his spouse. And I'm sure they had many discussions about that. And I don't need to talk about that. I'm talking about what contribution he made to the struggle for justice. If I have a concern about that, I need to demonstrate that through the relationship that I have with my wife, which I do. So start thinking that way, that's what you need to do, and stop worrying about what other people are doing when most of you ain't doing it yourself. And then lessons that we need to take from Dr. King is that faith alone, especially faith that's guided by the values of the capitalist system, and everybody's faith in this capitalist system, that's true. You can't deny. You're not operating your faith independent of the capitalist system. You have no evidence to demonstrate that whatsoever. So faith alone, because of that reality, it can't exist by itself. It has to be aided and supported by constant political education, and it has to be education that guides any type of mobilization work that takes place, any types of organization work. It has to be guided by that. And then courage, truth, and justice should be our only guidelines to what we do in this world. In other words, too many of us decide what we're going to do based on whose feelings is going to hurt or how uncomfortable it makes us to have to deal with the reality that people might not like what we have to say or what we're doing. Stop being such a goddamn coward, okay? Stop it. Stop it. Grow up and be an adult. My grandmother used to tell me, like, boy, you don't want everybody to like you. If everybody likes you, you're doing something wrong. And she was 100% correct. I don't give a damn if you don't like it. What the hell? You're not putting any food on my table. That's my daddy taught me. You're not putting any food on my table. I don't need you. You don't like me? Please, like Cat Williams said, if it's March and I got 15 haters, I'm trying to get to 20 by June, because that means that I'm doing something that's really consequential. And I got all this living in your head rent free, living in your head rent free. You're not living in my head. I'm not thinking about you 5 seconds. So I don't care what other people. I mean, it's great to be liked, but I'm not trying to be somebody that's doing things so that people like me. I'm trying to do what the best I can to do what's right. That's what I'm trying to do. And that requires courage, because you will stand alone when you do that. Because most people they don't have the courage to do what's right. They only can look at you and comment on what you're doing. And I know that. I have plenty of people doing that. And anybody that's doing this work has plenty of people doing it. But courage, truth, and justice have to be your guides for what you do. They can be the only guides. And if they're not, then there's something wrong. You're not doing it right. And your personal legacy will only hold strength if you stand up despite the consequences. Those of us who have engaged the struggle have paid a tremendous sacrifice for doing it. You have no idea. And if you're gonna live this life, and that's the reason why most of you don't do it, because you don't want to pay any costs. You just want to be comfortable. And I'm telling you right now, you'll never make any progress being comfortable. There's nothing you can do in life to advance yourself that you can do comfortably. You have to be uncomfortable. The discomfort is what you pushes you through to advance, to make the progress that you claim you want to make. That's how you make it, by being uncomfortable. You want to get a degree, you got to be uncomfortable. You want to have a baby, you got to be uncomfortable. You want to raise children, you got to be uncomfortable. You want to have the job you want, you got to be uncomfortable. You want to be the person that you should want to be, you have to make yourself uncomfortable. So your legacy will be determined by how much you do that. It means putting yourself in a position where you're not comfortable and learning to navigate through it. If the minute there's a problem, you back up and you can't deal with it, that's why you have the struggles that you have. And people like Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King should be examples to us of how we can be better people. We have strength within us that we don't even know we have. We just have to give ourselves the opportunity to believe in ourselves and to push forward. That's that man's legacy. Carry it forward, everybody. And let's do something with it so we can get out of this dreadful situation that we're in. That's what he would have wanted us to do. And I'll be damned, that's what we're going to do. Join us next week, you all, Sunday, March 31st. We're going to be talking about the conflict in Sudan. It's very tragic conflict for the people in Sudan. And of course, like everything else, there are concrete reasons why. So join us next week so we can hopefully provide you some information and education about why that situation is happening. The upper left-hand corner has a QR code. APRP programs are on there. Besides this one, information about how to log into those programs. The Forward Ever shop, so you can buy some clothes and support our revolutionary organization building. Good Communist, the revolutionary blog. They had a wonderful report back on their recent trip to Cuba 2 weeks ago here on Our Ancestors' Voices, and they had another one last Sunday. So you should read the articles they're writing on the blog about Cuba and stop listening to uh, uh, CBS, the NBC, and CIA telling you about Cuba. That's why you don't know a damn thing, because you're listening to those people. So do better, raise up your game, and go to betterworld.me for these episodes. You can get them. Join the All African People's Revolutionary Party. There on the bottom left is the URL to get more information about that, or join some organization, or start your own. If you don't want to work with us, you are not hurting our feelings. We have much bigger fish to fry than that kind of simple egoism. We want to be free. And we know we can't be free as long as so many of us aren't doing anything except watching TV and farting and eating and farting and defecating. We need people to do a lot more than that, at least a little more than that. So join some organization or start one. And then support Burkina Books down at the bottom right-hand side, the QR code. That's important. One of our on-the-ground projects in the APRP. We have others that we'll get to here on this program shortly. And my book is still out there. You can go to Amazon and get it. I wish it wasn't on Amazon, but unless you want to donate a full printing press and full postage, I don't want to hear your opinions about Amazon after you just went to Chevron and filled your car with gas. I mean, give me a break. This is a capitalist system. I'm using this book to bring down the system. So help me do that. The travels like I'm doing right now, where I'm at right now in Clanville, USA, designed to do work to build capacity for revolution. I fund these activities. I put gas in my car. I pay for this Clanville hotel I'm in right now from proceeds from this book. So please buy the book. Please encourage people to do it. And we appreciate you. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday evening. Join an organization working for our people, working for justice, forward ever, backwards never.